My name is Erin Zamora, and you are joining us for the M-TAC fifth and final session of our Building Cultural Responsiveness and Mobile Crisis Teams. So today we are joined with some wonderful subject matter experts from Stanford Sierra Youth and Families, and they're going to be talking with us about working with children, youth, and families in the crisis setting. This presentation was prepared for the M-TAC project, which is funded by DHCS and administered by CARS with AHP. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any of those agencies that I mentioned. All material appearing in this presentation, except for that taken directly from copyrighted resources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission. However, do not reproduce or copy and send it out for a fee for other people to buy without specific written authorization from the M-TAC project. This presentation is going to be recorded and posted on our website at a later date, so then everyone is able to learn and hear everything that our subject matter experts have for us today. All right, and to also do our California land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this virtual training is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. A land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardships and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. So let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. So moving forward today, again, this is our fifth and final session of the culturally responsive crisis care for children, youth, and families. Today we have Sydney Garola-Bice and Erin Hamilton, both joining us from Stanford Sierra Youth and Family Services. So super excited to have them here with us today. And so at this point, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Erin.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. And we're really excited to be supporting today's session on culturally responsive crisis care for youth, children, and families. Just a little bit about us. We are Stanford. We represent Stanford Sierra Youth and Families. We are a community-based mental health service provider for youth and families, serving several counties throughout Northern California. In addition to providing a range of mental health services for youth in the areas that we serve, we also provide foster care and foster care support services. We work with child who've been impacted or navigating the child welfare system, and adoption as well. And then we have some juvenile justice interventions. So we serve a range of youth who are navigating many different crises in Northern California. I'm going to be co-presenting today with my colleague, Sydney. Sydney is our family and youth partnership, one of our program managers in her specific department, supports our peer professionals. So those are individuals who come into the workforce based off of their lived experience, having navigated the systems that we're working in to support the provision of services. So really excited to hear from her experience and the work that she's done. And then I myself, I am our Associate Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So thank you. So just to share a little bit of our learning objectives and the things we'll explore today, we want to orientate ourselves with understanding youth and caregiver dynamics and how that influences how a youth may show up during a crisis and how to navigate those family dynamics. Looking at a whole child approach, honoring cultural and communication styles and the nuances of those when you're supporting a family navigating a crisis. What does it look like to support the youth? And then also, how do we empower the caregivers? We really want this to be an interactive session, so we'll bring in some vignettes, some real world examples, and hope there'll be an opportunity for some discussion through the chat and other means throughout this session today. So I'm going to kick us off with our first section today, discussing understanding youth and caregiver dynamics. And when we're talking about the dynamics of youth and caregivers, it really looks to the patterns of interactions. So when we talk about youth and caregiver dynamics, as I mentioned, this refers to the patterns and interactions of within the family roles of the youth that you're going to be supporting, as well as other individuals in the home. And this is through a range of different environments, whether they're in a home with like a traditional family setting, if they're in like in a residential care, in like a foster home, or a group home, or if they're living in another caregiving environment that may be outside of their natural supports. Um, these communications are often shaped by just the different connections within the families, their emotional connections, shared experiences, also communication styles. And we'll talk through a little bit about what those look like throughout the presentation. But it's also important to note that these dynamics can be healthy, meaning that there's a really supportive and nurturing family style or dynamic, but they can also be dysfunctional where there's a lot more chaos or conflict that could exist. So when we think about the key elements of youth and caregiver dynamics, the first is the roles within the family, and that's just understanding that each person within the family has a different role and responsibility, and this will often influence their interactions. So the role may be as the caregiver, like in a traditional setting, but then also somebody in the family, and this could either be the youth or the caregiver, could be maybe the peacemaker in the family. Somebody could take on the role of being somebody who's more rebellious in the family. So roles play an important part of the dynamics in the family and ultimately how you're going to interact with them. Hierarchy and power structures, again, that's like who's making decisions. And again, these roles can be fluid. Not all family cultures have the same dynamic where it's just the adult or the caregiver who is going to be the decision maker in the family. So those are important things to observe and understand as we're working with youth and families. Also communication styles. So understanding, is there an open and honest communication style? As we know, that would lend to more trust. Or is there a more like high conflict communication style in the family? As we know, that could lead to more misunderstandings and mistrust if there's poor communication. Are there healthy boundaries in the family where the caregiver operates in that capacity and the youth operates as kind of like a youth? Or are those lines more blurred? Do we have a youth who's being more parentified and taking on roles and responsibilities in the family dynamic that are outside of the traditional role of a youth? Because we know those types of unclear boundaries can cause additional tension. And then finally, cultural influences. We have a section where we'll talk through this more. But culture can play a big part in the dynamics of a family. So are there traditions and values or even societal expectations that shape how a family functions? These family patterns can develop over several different ways. Some of those are generational patterns. So those are things that are going to be passed down through generations, maybe like historically a part of a family's culture. These are life events. So major things that happen in a family, a death, a crisis, a blending of a family, a birth. As I've learned with a team, anytime you add or subtract a person from a team, it's a completely new team. And the same thing is with a family. So if there's a new marriage or a new relationship, right? Or if there's a recent divorce, all of those things can seriously impact a family dynamic because you are essentially working with a completely new family from the absence or addition of somebody. And then, of course, the external factors that we're all navigating, such as work challenges or unemployment, school, finances, just all of the things that could cause a serious impacts to a family culture. So again, to orient us, we thought it would be helpful to talk through some of the key factors that influence caregiver interactions during a crisis. So this is just really understanding what are all of the things that are at play when a youth is navigating crisis, and those things that we want to consider that are outside of the immediate situation that will help us understand how better to support them. So the stress and pressures that arise during crisis could often cause a heightened stress levels. And this, of course, could lead to an increased emotional reactivity, which is what you often see showing up as like that anger, that frustration, or even withdrawing from the current situation. And as the youth is navigating a crisis, it's important to note that the parents or caregivers may also struggle from a level of emotional dysregulation, meaning that they could, and this could impact how they're responding because they're also navigating having heightened emotions during this crisis. Also, communication patterns. We talked through this a little bit, but families in crisis can fall into dysfunctional communication patterns, and they may start to be avoidant. You could see there may be blaming an individual or things that may not be relevant to what's going on, or it could lead to excessive conflict. Open communication, of course, would encourage problem solving. But if there's a closed communication, then that's a part of the family dynamic and something that is kind of persistent, which may be leading to whatever the crisis is. This could lead to feelings of isolation and misunderstanding. And that's on both parties, not just that of the youth, but also the caregivers as well. And another communication pattern that we see sometimes in families who are navigating crisis in our work is that some families may start to minimize or deny the crisis, and that could often lead to more detrimental impacts for the youth who's navigating the crisis if they don't feel like they're being heard, and if their experiences are being minimized. So that's something that's also important to know, because it could really prevent having meaningful conversation and then ultimately the solutions that will lead to the positive outcomes for the youth. Understand the roles and responsibilities of a family during crisis, and understanding that those can sometimes shift, and they can shift in unhealthy ways. And what this could look like is a child being more parentified, so taking on caregiver roles that could be beyond their development in the time of a crisis. So the youth may be the one navigating a crisis, but they're having to take on and playing the support person for the caregiver in that moment, instead of being the one that's being cared for. Also, a family member may become a scapegoat. So there may be one person that is blamed for everything that's happening, but then there may be the fixer who comes in, and that is their role in that moment, where they come in and try to fix and solve all of the problems. And that, again, could be that youth who's navigating the crisis, but it could also be another youth or young person in the family, again, taking on a role and responsibility that may not be age appropriate, or the role that we would want them to take on in that moment. External supports are also a big key factor in influencing how caregivers are going to interact during a crisis. So families with stronger external support systems, meaning they have like extended family, a strong community system, even religious groups or communities that they're a part of, or even strong relationships with their care providers. If they're receiving other types of community-based services, if they have strong relationships with those individuals, these help support them cope better with crisis. But if we have families who don't have that same external support, it can really leave them feeling isolated and overwhelmed, and it can intensify the conflict that's going on, because oftentimes we know it's hard to see outside of what's going on immediately when you don't have a strong network of support or a soft place to land. There's also the cultural and social norms. So cultural beliefs really shape how families are going to view crisis, and also how they're going to navigate seeking support, and how they're going to express those things emotionally. I mean, how seriously they perceive the crisis at hand is one of the things that could be heavily impacted by the cultural norms of a family. Some cultures often emphasize collectivism, where they have it's all about like leaning on one another and solving problems together. And in these family systems, their extended family is going to play a big role in problem solving. Other cultures may emphasize individualism, where they're more self-reliant and they just figure out how they can do this within themselves as individuals, or within their more immediate smaller family unit. So understanding those dynamics will help understand how to support a family who's navigating crisis. And then also just naming, we know that a lot of cultures carry a lot of stigma around mental health and therapy, or receiving outside interventions, and that could play play a role in how we perceive the current crisis, right? So having a family that doesn't really view mental health as serious, or doesn't take it seriously, could interact how the caregivers are being able to show up for the youth in that moment. And then, of course, it's really important to understand the historical and societal influences, and the ways that generational trauma can impact the interactions during crisis. So trauma and adversity are often passed down by generations. And when families have experienced systemic discrimination, when they're experiencing violence, that's either violence in the community or interpersonal violence within the family unit. Violence, poverty is a big one. Especially, we know that oftentimes social issues that families are facing are exacerbated by poverty, and the things they're experiencing in the community, or displacement, having had unstable housing. This can can show up as mistrust for the systems, or hypervigilance, or even emotional withdrawal during crisis, especially if you have experiencing a lot of trauma in a family dynamic. So understanding those barriers, even the barriers of such as like racism, and being in like schools and communities that are under resourced, can really add to the chronic stress, and can limit the care that families are even open to receiving in a moment of crisis. So understanding how these inequities can shape how a family responds to crisis, and receive the opportunity for help, is really important in understanding how you can tailor your support to fit the needs of this individual family.
Yeah, and Erin, if I could hop in really quick, I think this is a perfect slide to kind of demonstrate how all of the previous learnings that we've had through this series and the different cultural groups, how it all comes together here to support the family and to support children, which is another cultural group as well. So we get to take all of the learnings that we had from the Asian American, from the Black community, from the Latinx community, and bring it all here as we're supporting the family and supporting the youth here. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be lots of interconnected themes that we'll touch on, because the families that we're going to be serving, we're thinking about navigating crisis with youth and families, are going to be are representing all the previous populations we've discussed. We have an example, then I have a couple of questions that I'll ask you to respond to in the chat. So a mother calls 911 because her teenage son is having a panic attack after a heated argument about school. When responders arrive, the mother is overwhelmed and yelling while the father is silent and withdrawn. The son is hyperventilating and refusing to talk. So what emotional interaction is the young person feeling in this moment? Think about what type of emotional interaction the young person is feeling. Definitely anger, anxiety, frustration. So the first step in how we respond is recognizing and understanding the emotions that are coming up for the young person. And yeah, all of those I would agree: overwhelmed, disconnected, fear, feeling not supported. So what are some of the emotions that we see that the caregiver is experiencing? Fear, yeah, in addition to the overwhelm. Frustration too, feeling overwhelmed, definitely. We see the withdrawal from the father, burnout, loss of control, definitely. The mom is asking for support, right? As she's the one who initiated the call, but the father is being withdrawn. So in this specific example, we see two different caregivers having very opposite reactions about how to support this youth in this moment. Right. And the youth is experiencing both their own emotions, but they're also in a way, maybe internalizing both the mother and the father's response in this moment. And just finally, what are some ways that we feel like the caregiver's reactions could be impacting the young person?
While folks are adding to that, I'd like to also add to that last question because something that I saw in the chat that really stood out to me was that fear component, right? When a family's got a lot going on at home, and then you take into consideration now first responders are starting to come to the home or law enforcement's coming to the home, that really adds an additional layer of stress and can really impact how families are then responding in addition to what they're already going through. So I really, really appreciated that insight as well. But I'll pass it back to you, Erin, for folks to share on that last piece.
Thinking I'm seeing some good things coming in the chat. Confusion, yelling can further exacerbate the reactions or the feelings. The youth definitely could be feeling helplessness right now in this moment, having to navigate both their own emotions and that of their mothers and their fathers. Yep, poor family unit cohesion, absolutely. So when we talk through like some ways that we want to respond to this, as you just did in the chat, recognizing how the family dynamics are contributing to this crisis and this situation, understanding the emotions that are coming up from each of the parties involved is helpful of getting a really holistic view of what the situation is, and then understanding how to support. Then, of course, adapting the interventions based on the communication styles that are already exist within the family, the stress levels, and of course the cultural beliefs if we feel like those may be impacting how the family is responding to the situation. And then, of course, when appropriate and we're able to connecting the family to those resources that can reinforce long-term stability for the family. So we know that acknowledging the mom's stress in this situation, and supporting her and stepping aside and supporting her and de-escalating her emotions, engaging the father separately to assess his understanding of the crisis, and of course seeing what support he needs, and then of course some grounding techniques for the youth. The main thing I'd like to highlight here is I think there's a part of ensuring that everybody in the family unit's experiences feel validated, is a really important part of supporting a youth in a family and navigating crisis. Because if we only focus on those of one person, we're not equipping everybody in the family unit in navigating this similar crisis the next time it comes up. And a big part of our mission at Stanford Sierra Youth and Families is around empowering families so each individual can thrive. And that really means giving everybody in the family the tools to support them in navigating the next crisis, so that the family now has the skills they need to continue to support one another with less community intervention, and they're able to find the tools all within their family unit. I'm going to pass it over to Sydney to talk through applying a whole child approach.
Thank you all so much for having me. It's such a privilege to be here in this space with you all. So as Erin had mentioned, I am a program manager at Sierra Youth and Families, so our family department, and that is of folks who all have lived experience in some capacity navigating system involvement, myself included. I've also worked as an advocate in our CSEC department, supporting youth who are at risk of exploitation or who are actively experiencing exploitation. And so I've had my hands in a little bit of both sides of it, right? So that lived experience piece as well as that professional piece. And I find that the most richest insights I've been able to learn in my journey has been from the lived experience piece. And I think, as Erin mentioned, with all of those key components that we're going through, we're talking a lot about the how today. And I think something that's important to mention too is, why are we here talking about this? Because it's really important for families, for youth and families to feel seen. And we're going to be going further in depth about how we can do all of these. And how we do that is also with the whole child approach. So first, we're going to be talking about the safety first approach, which is essentially establishing a secure and calm environment. And there are risks when we don't do that, right? And so some risks of that are overlooking the emotional and psychological safety, which can then undermine trust and escalate future crisis. And the impact that can have is youth may feel unsafe with their responders or their environment, which then reduces their willingness to engage. And then the family risks. Families may even feel blamed or misunderstood, which then leads to resistance in accepting the help or following through with their care plans. And then that emotional support piece. So validating feelings, building trust, and using a trauma-informed care lens. So the risk of not doing so is focusing only on behavior without addressing the grief, anxiety, or trauma, which may miss the root causes of crisis. I know in my personal experience when I was navigating crisis, and I have a handful of experiences with 5150 holds, and it was the times where I wasn't seen or assumptions were being made about what it is that I needed, that then led to me shutting down almost immediately. And that all comes from bias, right? We all have our own bias and our own assumptions based on our own experiences about what people need, but it's really important for us to slow down. No matter how long we've been in the field professionally, or no matter how much lived experience that we do have, it's really important that we take those intentional pauses, right, to really see and hear people for what they're sharing, they're going through, so that we could respond accordingly, and so that we're actually validating those feelings and listening to understand rather than listening to respond. And then that third piece, that social connection. So essentially engaging caregivers, school personnel, and community resources. And this is that piece of, it takes a village, right? And so there are so many people rallying around youth. And so how are we ensuring that we are keeping our caregivers engaged in the whole process, our school personnel? And the risk with that is that we then ignore their peer relationships, their school dynamics, or even social inclusion, which then leaves the youth without having those protective buffers, right? And in a perfect world, youth and families won't need us. They'll have all of the natural supports and things that should be there to begin with, but that's not always the case. So really making sure that we are looking at their social networks of folks. That way they can have the tools they need to navigate the crisis without our support. And then that cognitive development piece, communicating in an age-appropriate manner and provide strategies for emotional regulation. So crisis interventions that dismiss the youth's perspective can further erode confidence and problem-solving abilities. And the impact that can have is that youth may then internalize helplessness or disengage from school and learning. And then the whole family risks experiencing feeling misunderstood or behavioral concerns as academic failure rather than developmental stress and responses. So it's really important to consider that there are many different layers of it, and we can't just look at one piece without considering another. And then that physical health component. So access basic needs like hunger, sleep, and medical concerns. Um, if the youth are having a really hard time, maybe they just need something to eat. It sounds like such a simple thing, but if a youth hasn't had any, or anyone hasn't had anything to eat or drink, it could really impact your mood and your ability to show up. Even just going to school and being expected to show up and perform in those spaces without, yes, hanger, absolutely. With being expected to perform at 100%, without having your very basic needs. If you're tired, if you didn't sleep somewhere safe the night before, all of these things are really important, and having their basic needs met is the very bare minimum that needs to be looked at and addressed. And so what is the family-centered practice? So for the whole child approach and for family-centered practice are both evidence-based practices. And this is essentially the core belief um, of family-centered practices, and that the best way to support an individual in crisis is by working within their family system. So how are we looking at everybody and how are we supporting everybody? And families play a critical role in ensuring safety, stability, and long-term well-being. And so this is really important. And sometimes it may seem obvious to folks, but it's something that's really real, especially when you consider our youth who are in our foster care system, who maybe there is a bias against the resource parents or there's a bias against their birth families. We all come with it, as I've mentioned. And so really, how are we looking at the family as a unit, and how are we supporting everybody, and how are we being present with them? And here are some of those principles of a family-centered approach. So first, connecting, engaging with family members to understand their lives, goals, strengths, and challenges while building a trusting relationship between the family and practitioner. And so depending on the context of when we're going out to see families, right? Sometimes we don't always have several sessions to then build rapport. Sometimes we're going and we're providing support and we need to be there right there in the middle. But how are we really just taking those times to make those connection points and seeing them as a person? I see you're wearing a shirt with that band. I really enjoy that band. It's really just those small things that we can do to just see who we're serving as people, and how do we take those little nuggets of things that we can really do to really see them and kind of help just break that barrier a little bit, because there is a power dynamic when we're coming into those space. And so how are we connecting with them and holding that space and really seeing them as people? And then collaborating, working alongside the family to set goals, strengthen their capacity, and support informed decision making. And it's really important to that piece of working alongside the family. We always want to make sure that we're building and we're helping support a goal that makes sense with the family and that has their buy-in. Because of course, everyone always feels that, if only the family just did this, or if only the youth just did this, then everything would be fine, right? But that's not reality. It's always easier for an outsider looking in to diagnose solutions to what we perceive to be the problem, right? But it's really important to work in collaboration with those folks that we're connecting with and supporting to see how we can meet them where they're at and how we can support them based on what they feel like is reasonable. And then customizing, providing individualized, culturally responsive, and evidence-based interventions tailored to each family's unique needs. So really not seeing families as all the same. It's not supportive to feel like you're getting a cookie cutter approach when it comes to your services or when it comes to support. And that's really just emphasizes that piece of really seeing people for who they are and for what they're needing. And then integrating, recognizing that family centered practice spans the full continuum of community-based services and is not limited to a single service or model. And so some strategies for responders, establishing trust and rapport. So essentially that engagement stage, right? So approach families with empathy, patience, and a non-judgmental attitude. I know we can all feel like when it does, sometimes we don't have to even say it directly, but we could definitely feel when we are being judged. It comes from our body language, our tone, how we're positioning ourselves in the certain space. So it's really important to be mindful of all of those things, and they do impact how we are serving our youth and families. And I know for myself personally, being on the recipient end of receiving support in a crisis situation, the attitude and the response that I was met with really impacted how I then cooperated, I guess, in those situations. If I felt that I was being heavily judged, I know when I was sent to the ER for suicidal ideation, felt very much judged for being there because the assumption was, well, you don't have a broken bone. You're honestly just taking up a bed for somebody that really needs it. And that was very much felt. It wasn't said out loud, but how I was treated and things that were said around me and to me very much felt like it wasn't a safe space. So because it didn't feel safe, I didn't want to share anymore. And it honestly just prolonged the experience even further than it needed to. So really being mindful of how we're presenting ourselves in a space, and are we leading or support with any of our judgments or bias, and really make sure that we're checking that. If we find that we are getting into this pattern of meeting folks with judgment and bias, consult with your supervisor and just talk it out. And really seeing is that that you need for yourself to address this particular pattern that keeps coming up. And then involving families in decision making. So that collaboration piece we previously talked about, right? Recognizing that the family is a key partner in crisis and in planning, and asking them about their concerns, their strengths, and what's worked for them in the past, and support the shared decision making rather than imposing solutions. It's really easy for us to come quick with our solutions, but really taking that pause and hearing some things that they would like to share and what they've already tried, and really just brainstorming with them than doing for them. And then strengthening that caregiver capacity. So essentially that empowerment piece, right? And so offering practical guidance on de-escalation techniques and coping strategies, and educating caregivers on recognizing crisis triggers and early warning signs. And then also reinforcing their strengths and encouraging resilience-based approaches. And then maintaining that flexibility and sensitivity as well. So adapting our interventions based on the evolving needs of a family, and recognizing that every family is unique and what works for one family may not work for another. And being mindful of that trauma history also to avoid re-traumatization. And so that comes with asking the family lots of open questions, really seeing what it is that they've tried in the past, what hasn't worked, and helping support them from that perspective. And promoting family stability beyond the crisis, which is that sustainability piece, right? And so, as I mentioned, ideally, we are not a part of families' lives at all. Families would have the tools that they need to have all of the things to help them cope through their crisis moments and situations. But the reality is that's not the case for all families. That's not the case for all people. But how are we then instilling those things into families so that when they do touch us, we're leaving them better off without us in the future for when crisis happen? And then we're encouraging them to have long-term plans for managing their future challenges. And that's not putting band-aids on the solutions, right? Are the suggestions we're providing, or are the suggestions that we're collaborating with the family going to be sustainable long-term? Or is this going to be something that this will work for the next week, but then you may need to contact us again? So really making sure we're being really intentional and connecting with our colleagues and with our families and seeing, okay, how can we support you in a way that feels good long-term? So you all can see it, but I'm also just going to read it out loud. So you respond to a call about a 16-year-old African-American girl named Jasmine who is experiencing a mental health crisis at home. Her mother is concerned about her escalating anxiety and panic attacks. At school, Jasmine has been crying uncontrollably and refused to return to class after a confrontation with the teacher. She stated she feels trapped, that no one listens, and that she was done trying. Upon arrival at the home, responders find Jasmine in her bedroom, visibly distressed and withdrawn. She shares that she has been struggling with intense grief after losing her grandmother, who was a central figure in her life. She also describes feeling isolated due to the mean comments from peers at school and is frustrated with teachers dismissing her concerns. Her mom appears defensive and overwhelmed, insisting that Jasmine doesn't need therapy and that our family handles things our own way. And we're going to be talking about some considerations based on that vignette that we just read. So as the crisis team works to assess Jasmine's needs, these are some of the following challenges that then emerge from that, right? So Jasmine has difficulty trusting authority figures, feeling that her previous counselors and school staff have failed to advocate for her. Her family expresses distrust of the mental health system, citing past experiences of racial bias in medical settings, and that the crisis team is predominantly composed of providers unfamiliar with Jasmine's background and familial dynamics. And so based on these things that we know from that vignette, feel free to write in the chat, how might us as responders use a family-centered approach to support Jasmine and Miss Carter? Grandma, provide resources, but trust Jasmine's family has the best intentions for her. Love that. What ordinarily does work for your family and why isn't that working now? I love that. Absolutely. So for those of you that have shared so far, that's really great to get us started. So opening up the conversation and seeing what has worked for you all in the past, validating their feelings, acknowledge them and acknowledge that they make sense. And validation is really, really big. It's one of those things that sometimes feel like When we're responding to a crisis, we're going and we have our checkbox of things that we want to meet, right? But sometimes just really slowing down and validating fully what someone is experiencing, because everyone has their own experiences and they are valid in their eyes. And what may be an experience of Jasmine's versus her mother's could be totally different, even though they're within the same proximity of a particular environment. So really just seeing that individual's perspective.
Kind of along of what Manning was saying, what ordinarily does work for your family. Like, we're not here to be the experts in their mental health or their family system or their family dynamic. So it's not like, we're here to save that a day, but no, like what does work? What has historically supported you? What has historically helped, and how can we bring that back into the present to help with this situation too? So I think that was like, just building off of Manning's comment. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's a really great point to address too, right? Is that our families are the experts. They know a lot more about their lives than we do. We're there for such a short period. So really making sure we're taking advantage of that space to be able to learn from them so that we could support them through their lens. And so some key takeaways for crisis teams. So first, building trust through cultural humility, acknowledging past and present experiences of bias in mental health and social systems, and avoiding assumptions, asking those open-ended questions and honoring their identity, their tradition, and their lived experience. And engaging family as collaborative partners, involving caregivers and support networks early in the process, respecting their insights, even if they differ from clinical models, while offering transparent guidance. Something that I've seen some folks really struggle with in this field is when families' insights really differ from their own personal familial insights. And so that's really something that we want to make sure that we're always on top of, right? And we're consulting with our supervisors, consulting with our colleagues, and that if we find that we are unintentionally leading with our bias based on our own personal experiences, we're addressing that. Because at the end of the day, we're not supporting our families the way they need it when we are leading with that kind of lens. And then centering our youth voice with validation. So respecting the young person's feelings back without judgment, and affirming their language. And it makes sense that you're feeling overwhelmed instead of clinical labels, right? We always want to adjust how we're speaking to youth based on if it's age appropriate. Youth get really frustrated in my experience when we come heavy with our clinical jargon. So really making sure that we're being very intentional when we're talking to our young people. And then uplifting those cultural strengths and coping tools, asking about music, movement, rituals, or ancestral wisdom that the youth connects with, and highlighting resilience already demonstrated in their community or their family. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're connecting to identity aligned resources. So if it's relevant, recommending faith-based counseling, cultural affinity groups, or peer mentors if applicable, and ensuring follow-up supports to support the youth's language, identity, and worldview.
Thank you, Sydney. So I'm going to talk through honoring cultural and communication styles, and I'm really feeling like this is just going to be a refresher about a lot of the things that you have explored in the previous sessions, where you really delved into each of those individual cultures and identities that you may be serving in the community. So I will provide some examples, but really just exploring you to refresh and to revisit some of those key concepts that came up as we think about the diversity of the community that we're serving. So we're thinking about honoring the culture of a family. It really means just adapting to the diverse cultural perspectives and the communication style. So recognizing and respecting and even adjusting our approach based on the cultural backgrounds of the youth and families that we're serving, their values, their communication styles, and just how best to engage with them. So there's a couple of key aspects that I'll talk through when we think about how we would adapt our cultural preferences and communication styles to family. And the first one is understanding the cultural beliefs about mental health. And this has come up a lot. We've talked, there are lots of different communities that have various ideas about mental health. Some believe that mental health is something that's more faith-based and that it should belongs in your faith-based community. Other cultures and maybe don't understand mental health the same way, and it's something that's more of a private family matter. But just understanding that different cultures and different groups have different views about mental health. And this is really going to dictate how they're going to show up in a crisis. And also that there's a lot of stigma around mental health, and that's going to affect someone's openness to receiving help or even seeking help. So I think when we think about the stigma around mental health and how that can prohibit a family from even seeking mental help, just honoring the fact that a family reached out for help in a moment of need, I think is a huge win. When we're talking about redefining successful engagement, which is something that we talk about in a lot of work that we do, that is the first win, right? Is that a family who was in need reached out for support. So just honoring and celebrating them for taking that first step, because it's really a huge sign that they really care about their young person and that they want the best outcome from them, even if mental health is something that is not always immediate in their family culture. And then also just understandings about healing practices and other coping mechanisms and how they may be more traditional or faith-based. Adjusting our communication styles really speaks to the fact that some cultures value direct and assertive communication, while others may prefer a more indirect or relationship-centered dialogue. So, utilizing the information that you've received in previous sessions, your own understanding about different culture groups, and also what you observe, just taking a second to observe what's going on in the interactions amongst the family members is a good way to understand in the moment what their communication preference is. Is it more collaborative where we're all talking in this group, or is there a certain individual who may be more of the spokesperson for the family that we speak with that individual and they relay the message because that's how that family interacts, right? So understanding what their specific cultural, communication preferences are. And then in our body language and how we show up. So eye contact, personal space. Like, are we talking from a far distance? Are we talking a little bit closer to one another? What is our tone and our cadence? Because that could really have different meanings across cultures. And then, of course, being aware of language barriers and using interpreters and other culturally appropriate interpretation or translation services when needed. That's really important. One of the things that we find in the work that we do supporting youth and families in the community is oftentimes when a family may be coming to receive services, there may be an insecurity around the language barrier, and they may struggle to understand something instead of asking for an interpreter because they don't want to feel like they're being that extra burden, right? But we know that can really impede positive outcomes in service delivery if a family is struggling to understand something, when we could have brought in an interpreter or utilized, somebody who speaks the family's native language. So really supporting the family in receiving linguistically appropriate services when possible, and just, I think, inviting them to do so and then reminding them that it's okay. Like, our goal is to support you in whatever way feels appropriate. And this is not an extra like burden or task on us to provide you interpretation services. But this is because we want to ensure positive outcomes. And if you don't fully understand what's going on or how we can support you, we know that that's not going to support this situation as a whole. So encouraging the family and supporting them in utilizing those services they need to. The other thing that we want to highlight, or key aspect, is building cultural humility and sensitivity. And one of those ways we do that is avoiding assumptions and stereotypes about a person's background or experiences. If we are interacting with somebody and we know they may have a different cultural identity from us, and we know that there may be a stigma that exists around mental health, that could sometimes unconsciously dictate how we interact with that person. I, being an African American woman, know that there are certain parts of my family where mental health is something that's still a bit taboo, right? So I don't want to approach somebody assuming that they don't really value mental health or mental health services and treat it as something that's routine and I'm just showing up because I'm supposed to, but this person doesn't really care about like this mental health perspective, right? Because that's we're not a monolith, so not every family is going to have that experience, right? So understanding that that's something that may exist within a family culture, but it doesn't mean that every single family is going to show up that way. That's a part of avoiding those stereotypes about a person's background and experiences. And one of the ways that we can kind of do that and understand a family's culture and where they are, like, and help us to meet them where they are, is asking those open-ended questions to help understand their perspective. We talked earlier about asking like what has worked for you in the past, really understanding in that short time you may have with a family about like what their preferences are, what things they've done in the past, and around that whole family idea of family-centered practices. Of course, also being mindful about historical or systemic factors that may impact the trust to the mental health. That's why asking those open-ended questions and really supporting the family to lead the way that services are being provided and how they're being supported is really helpful. It doesn't cast us in a position of power or authority where we're coming and we're telling you what you're going to do or what you need to do, but we're walking alongside you and just being an additional part of that community, right? That's going to support you in this time of need. And then finally, incorporating culturally relevant support systems. So encouraging and talking to the family about what those other community support services or culturally relevant services they have, or their community leaders who they lean on for support in times of need. Are there religious or spiritual leaders, or just other trusted figures or individuals in their community, even agencies that they've worked with, that they've established a relationship with, or they may be culturally responsive. Are there those partners that we could support connecting the family with, or that they may have the ability to reach out to on their own? And then also recognizing the family role, and are they more of an individual family culture where they're going to make this decision, or are they more collectivist where they believe in like group and consensus decision making where they're going to work together? And then offering alternative support options that align with their cultural values, that again, encouraging and supporting the family and reaching out to their natural supports, but also their community supports that may speak more to the family's culture, needs, and preferences. And then these are just some examples to think about understanding and addressing the cultural barriers in crisis intervention. So these are from the scenario that we just talked through with Sydney when we were looking at applying a whole child approach in family center practices. In this scenario, we had Jasmine, who was a 16-year-old who was experiencing a mental health crisis. And she was struggling with grief and feeling isolated. She reported feeling unheard both at school and at home, and her mom resisted therapy, emphasizing that our family handles things our way. So some of the cultural barriers that were identified in this interaction in this vignette were that the mental health stigma that the mom had about therapy is maybe unnecessary, and reflecting a cultural belief in family-centered or family-based problem solving, that the family will handle things within their own family unit. Also trust issues, Jasmine feeling like she dismissed by authority figures, and leading to her willingness to engage with them, right? So having that relationship tension between those who've been seen in a position of power in her, because she's felt like she hasn't been heard by them. And you coming in as another adult may be entering into this relationship and maybe put in that position based on her previous experiences. We can't fault the individual for that, right? But how do we navigate around that? And how do we honor that experience and work around that to still support the youth? And then also cultural isolation and microaggression. Understanding that Jasmine's distress and what she's experiencing in that moment is also compounded by the experiences that she's having at school amongst her peers and the adults around her that are making her feel excluded. So we have all of these things happen simultaneously, and that's how those are the challenges that the family's experiencing. So when we are looking at a culturally responsive approach, we first want to validate her experiences and her emotions. So acknowledge both Jasmine's grief and frustration without minimizing her pain, but also reassure her mom that supporting her mental health really does align with the family's strength, right? Because the mom's ultimate goal is not saying that we don't handle these things. She says that we handle them our own way. Language is really important because that could have easily been dismissed as this is not important, right? But it's not. She says that is not our way of handling. We have our own way. So it was still something that we value, honor, and that we will address. We just have our own way of doing so. Um, Also adapting our communication to build trust. Again, using those open-ended questions about how does your family typically support each other during these times, since they do have their own way of handling things. And framing therapy as a collaborative tool, right? This is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and this is not a singular intervention that is going to solve everything, but this could be a part of a larger system of care and supports that are available when it's necessary and when it feels appropriate. And then incorporating those cultural and community support. So suggesting alternatives, right? If therapy, a more traditional mental health services does not seem like the right fit for that family in that moment, talking through what are some of those other external parts of Jasmine in the family's community that could support ensuring that her needs are still met. Because at the end of the day, that is the goal, is to make sure that the youth needs are met and that the family unit is set up in a way that is sustainable and that they're able to thrive and navigate the next crisis with less outside intervention and support. So what do we do to support the family and set them up for success to do this in the next time something comes up? And hopefully those incidents are fewer and far between subsequently. All right, and we'll move to supporting youth and the child in crisis. Move to Sydney.
We're going to talk about some more tangible examples of how we could best support our youth and children in crisis, right? So children and youth definitely respond differently to crisis. Unlike adults, young people often lack the emotional vocabulary or regulation skills to articulate what they're experiencing. Our youth almost always know what it is. It's just sometimes being able to get the words out and explain what it is to another adult can be really hard. So how are we extending grace in those moments, and how are we getting creative with our interventions and really just holding space to kind of guide the youth to figuring out what it is that they're struggling with in that moment. And behavior may be a communication of distress, not necessarily defiance or manipulation. And trauma informed response is critical. And so a trauma informed lens shifts the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And that's a really important thing to continuously remember as we're going through these stages of helping support youth that are in crisis. So, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. And trauma informed care recognizes how past experiences then shaped our current responses and prioritizes emotional safety. And there's also that key component of the power of a calm and empathetic presence, right? And so even as adults, if you are met with somebody, if you are just really escalated and you're feeling overwhelmed, I know personally for me, I'm not going to feel any less overwhelmed if I'm also in a space with somebody who is also very escalated, because the energy tends to feed off of each other, right? So how are we being that calm person and being that empathetic presence with a youth as they're navigating their crisis? And our calm demeanor really helps regulate their nervous system by being in that space. And compassion then reduces defensiveness and creates a safe environment for de escalation. And trust begins with understanding, validating emotions, even when they're intense or confusing, helps the child feel seen and heard. And empathy is not an agreement, it's connection without judgment. And it also helps prevent further harm when we support our youth from this lens, because harsh or reactive responses can just further escalate and cause emotional re traumatization, which at the end of the day would then lead to a youth or family not reaching out for support to begin, or again in the future if they need it because they initially had a traumatizing experience. And then creating a safe space for expression as well. Emotional expression should be welcome and not punished. And safe expression is foundational to healing, trust building, and future engagement. And the key takeaway of this is that meeting youth in crisis with empathy and patience, it's not just best practice, it's really essential for long-term sustainability and emotional and psychological well-being. So some tangible strategies for supporting youth and children. So as we mentioned, staying calm and regulating our own emotions. Children mirror adult responses, and our calm presence really supports that co-regulation, right? And helping the child begin to calm by anchoring your own steadiness in that space. And using soft, non-threatening body language and maintaining an open posture and neutral tone. So how we are presenting ourselves in that space really makes a difference. Are we showing up standing over the family? Are we going down and we're meeting them eye to eye and we're getting more at their level? Even sometimes how we dress can be really intimidating to families. I know at our agency for our direct care staff, it's definitely not encouraged, and I don't know how many other agencies also do this. I feel like it's most at this point, but we don't meet our families in suits and ties and super formal attire for the most part. Folks are pretty casual because that just helps take down that additional layer um, of stress for families, seeing that, we are kind of taking down that additional barrier of the power dynamic.
As Sydney shared, yeah, using soft and non-threatening body language, and also how we show up. And one of the reasons it's important that we don't wear suits and ties, and just we don't want to cast ourselves in a position of power over the family. Like, we're a professional that you are coming in because you need saving, right? We're additional community support that's coming to walk alongside and support you. Also giving clear and simple choices. So when somebody is navigating crisis, giving them too many options, or just using a lot of complicated language and jargon can exacerbate whatever is going on in that moment. So making sure you're giving clear, simple directives that are easy to understand, and that won't overly complicate or add any additional stress or anxiety to what's going on in that moment. Also validating their emotions. We talked about this both with a caregiver and with a youth, but not just validating what they're experienced in that moment and what brought them to this place, and letting them know that they're not alone. A lot of times when you're navigating a crisis, you can feel really alone and isolated, like you're not being heard or understood. And that could be a part of the feelings that led you up to that moment. So having somebody come and validate your experience and what you're going through, and give you some type of reassurance, it can be really helpful. And then finally, using grounding techniques to help encourage, like even getting the youth into a space that might be more calm, right? And some of the vignettes and examples that we've used, if you're in a space where there's like elevated caregivers and there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot of other yelling and high emotions and stuff like that. Sometimes removing yourself from that situation, even if it means taking a couple of steps away, can help just help with re-regulating the youth and giving them a moment in a space, right? Because it's hard to hear yourself and understand what you're experiencing if you have a lot of other things going on, especially if you're working with a youth or a young person who has taken on some parental role, right? So while they're navigating crisis, they may also feel like they're in a space where they need to support and hold the hand of their caregiver, making sure that that person's okay. So giving them even a couple of steps away or a little bit of space to be in a space where they can start to gain a little bit of clarity and re-regulate can be super helpful. And before we transition to our last session, I'll pass back to Sydney to see if she had anything to add.
So some additional pieces I'd also like to add is avoiding blame or dismissal, right? And so acknowledging that there is a distress without judgment. And we talked about that a lot so far, of just being mindful of our biases and also offering that predictability. Explain what will happen next in very simple terms to the family we're supporting. So when families are navigating that crisis in the moment, your head can kind of be all over the place. So really just being that person to be grounded in the space and just to explain clearly, okay, this is what we talked about today. These are some next steps. Let's try that on for X amount of days or however, whatever plan that you guys develop together. But really being mindful about that piece and offering that predictability and transparency in our communication. And also empowering their voice and asking them what would help you feel better right now. We created this plan for the next days, weeks. What do you need right now to help you feel more grounded? And really just holding that space for them. All right, and then those can also consider cultural and personal context as well. So, of course, adapting our interventions to their lived experiences and really making sure that as we're supporting our kiddos, we're encompassing all of those things to ensure that they feel supported and that we can walk away from the space knowing and confident that they have what they need to feel supported.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk through our final section, which is around empowering and assisting caregivers. So I thought this was a really powerful quote to lead us into our final section and to kind of bring home what we've been discussing today. But if you can't change reality, change your perception of it. This is by Audre Lorde, and it really speaks directly to the experiences of caregivers who are navigating their a youth or young person's mental health crisis. Because while we may not be able to immediately change the situation that they're in, we can support them in reframing how they see their role, how they see their youth or young person or their child in that moment, and the system around them. And really understanding that empowerment begins with perspective. So helping caregivers see that their strength and recognizing what is within their control in that moment, because it's hard to feel like lots of things you can't control. It's easy to feel like everything's out of your control. But if we reframe it and start to think of, I can't control that, right? But this is what I can control. We can help them feel like they're not alone. And when we're able to validate their emotions and offer culturally responsive support, we can start to shift the narrative of what they're experiencing from something that feels really isolated and helpless to something where they feel really connected and they start to feel empowered. Supporting caregivers. So it's really helping us to understand that caregivers play a critical role in the emotional well-being of our youth, but they often also will experience their own high levels of stress and uncertainty during a crisis. So supporting them in knowing supporting them with like knowledge and resources around like how they can continue to support their youth can make a meaningful difference in their ability to care for a child. This means understanding that they may feel overwhelmed, they might feel frustrated and helpless, and recognizing their emotional and practical challenge will help us understand how we can offer compassionate and tailored support to them. And then also equipping them with tools. So supporting the caregivers and understanding that they cannot pour from an empty cup. we overuse the term self-care a lot. I think we talk about a lot of mental health and in the support service or any helping profession, right? But it really comes down to like community care and wellness. So how do we support in the caregiver and understanding that their ability to take care of themselves and to show up for themselves will have a positive impact on their ability to support their youth and their navigating crisis. All right. So just supporting and encouraging them to take time and take space. And sometimes that means giving the caregiver a moment to take a couple of steps away from the situation so that they can have a moment to feel like they've had space to regulate what's going on. But I would invite you into the chat to share, how can we ensure that caregivers are feeling supported when they're helping a young person navigate a crisis? So if you have something from your own experience or things that have come up throughout the session that you would like to offer, what are some ways that you think we can support caregivers to feel empowered while they're helping a young person? Yes, definitely listening to understand. So practice the active listening and listening both with our body language and to understand what they're experiencing and empathizing as well. Making sure everybody has time to share their version of the story. That one is big. If we only leave one person to share their version of the story, especially when there are multiple caregivers in the home, oftentimes it's the one who's always sharing their experience who we're going to hear from, and that person who feels unheard is going to continue to feel that way. And us empowering the family as a unit to thrive ensures that every perspective is heard, because there may be something very telling from the perspective that's often missed. Keep in mind sequential escalation techniques. The caregiver is often still stressed when the client enters resolution. Absolutely. Yep. Asking them how they would like to be assisted. Again, that family-centered practices. So leaning back into the family unit about how they would like to be supported and what we can do for them. Separate the parties, validate, attempt to understand. Yeah, bring them back together when everybody is ready. Parent partners. We have parent partners at our organization as well. And they are such a huge support in as the client is a youth, that the parent also feels supported while we're providing services. So yes, definitely working with a parent partner, especially when you have somebody with a lived experience or who has navigated something similar, to really validate from a really like humanistic perspective of like, I've been through this too. I understand, right? So maybe not everything that you're going through, but I've been through something similar, and just having somebody who can speak that language and understand is always really helpful. So having a peer professional, a parent partner is a great strategy as well. And just acknowledging the way that they feel, providing them with support. Awesome. Those are a lot of great answers. So thank you. All of this comes around is just acknowledging and supporting the parent or the caregiver as as the person who is there to both support the youth, but also who may need support themselves. And I don't think we mentioned this at the beginning of the session, but we use caregiver a lot instead of parent. And that comes from working with in the child welfare system, doing foster care and adoption. The parent is not always the support system for a youth. So we like to use the term caregiver as an umbrella term, because whatever individual who's caring for the child in that space, it doesn't change the value of that person in the child's life. So we use caregiver as an umbrella term. We also will use, instead of saying child or child and youth, sometimes we'll say young person, again, as an umbrella term for all young people who may be receiving services. I want to add that at the very end.
Erin, you shared something that I'd like to touch on a little more too. I mean, you shared that all caregivers. And I think this is something that is really important to address too, because something that our parent partners at our agency have been doing a lot of coaching and support with our partners, is that how are we seeing both mom and dad, if it is a mom and dad dynamic in the home? Because oftentimes dads are forgotten about. And so how are we making sure that we're not defaulting to mom with all the support, and that we are seeing both parents, especially if they're both involved? And so we really just wanted to add that additional piece, but I will pass it back to you.
Thank you for highlighting that, Sydney. That's huge. And that is something that comes up a lot. So yes, all of the parents or caregivers in the home. And we also have families who are doing multi-generational living, and the grandparents may be tasked as caregivers often when the parents are off at work. So again, all of the supports there that are there for a family, making sure that we're hearing all those perspectives. But fathers, we do hear a lot or left out. So making sure that just we're including everybody's perspectives. Thank you for highlighting that, Sydney. So this is actually our final slide, and we'll move into some Q&A. But here's some steps that we wanted to share for supporting the caregivers. And I think this will just be a reiteration of some of the things that we've already shared. But the first one is validating their experience and really just acknowledging that their emotions, their stress and concerns that they may be coming up, and then showing empathy as we offer them support. So instead of minimizing their struggle and just focusing on the youth, really affirming them in an effort to support the youth. And because by affirming and supporting the caregiver, we're naturally going to be able to provide better support for the youth. So, and that's by saying things like, it makes sense that you're feeling overwhelmed. I know that this is a lot to carry in this moment. Or, I know that you're doing your best in this really hard situation. I'm here to listen. You don't have to go through this alone. I hear you. Your feelings are valid, and it's okay to be triggered or angry or scared in this moment. Providing clear and practical guidance, offering specific de-escalation strategies, of course, like using a calming tone, creating that safe space, really helping them understand the triggers and effective ways to respond. So that's like, let's talk through a few things that we can try next time that your child or your young person is feeling escalated. Sometimes saying things like, sometimes small adjustments like speaking softly or creating calm space can make a big difference. It's okay that it doesn't work perfectly every time. What matters is that you keep showing up, right? So giving them some practical examples or things that they can use next time to talk through with their youth. Also connecting them to resources. So sharing other mental health resources, peer support, or even, again, working with them to understand what those other resources are available in their community that might be culturally responsive, and working with them to identify some of those and then get connected with them. So there's also support available for you as well as the caregiver. Is it okay to ask? It's okay for you to ask for help too. Asking them, would it be helpful if I shared some resources or supports, services that other families that I've worked with have found helpful? Here are some resources that I feel like would align closely with your family's values or your culture. Would you like more information on those? Saying those things like that to support the family. And then finally, I'm encouraging self-care and reliance. That word again, self-care, but again, just reminding the caregiver that they can't pour from an empty cup. So saying things like, let's think about who you can lean on right now, because nobody should have to go through this alone. Or it's okay to take a break. Rest isn't a luxury. It's a part of resilience. So encouraging to take space when they need it. If they have younger children, right? Asking, what are your other supports? Who can step in when you need a moment, right? Because maybe you being overwhelmed, the child being overwhelmed, maybe that it could be contributing to these crisis moments that are happening. So what supports do you have to make sure that you can take some space when you need it? What's one small thing that you can do for you this week, right? Maybe those incremental changes can lead to significant outcomes, right? So it doesn't have to be the big thing that you're going to commit to through the rest of the year, but what's one thing you're going to do in the next 24 hours? What's one thing you can do for yourself in this next week to give yourself some space? And then saying things like, you matter too. Taking care of yourself helps you take better care of your child. So a concerned caregiver is always going to care about the youth and their needs first, and putting them as the primary person that needs taking care of, but the caregiver needs support as well. So reminding them and encouraging them to take space when they need it. All right. I think we're able to transition into questions. I'll pass it back to you, Erin.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Sydney, for this amazing training. We delved into a lot of different parts in working with families, working with youth, working with the caregivers. We have, with a different project, developed the Caregiver Toolkit. And so that is an amazing resource for all of our field responders, for the families to have, and how to navigate the help, how to be able to access different resources when you're working with families and caregivers and youth. Let's see, Hector says, what do you think is a winning way to connect with the youth of the day?
I can add my thoughts. I know something that always works with youth or young people is just connecting with them on like music culture or anything that like take into consideration their surroundings. Are they wearing like a particular shoes? Like do they like are they wearing dunks or not? You know what I mean? Like finding different things that they're wearing. If you happen to be in their home, are there any posters on the wall? really pay attention to your environment and just having an organic conversation to help kind of break the ice a little bit about something that's right there. And you'll find pretty quickly that that kind of just gets them the space to breathe and just talk about something normal for a second before all the hard stuff comes into play. So I know that's something that has always worked fairly well for me.
Yeah. I would agree with what Sydney said, right? Paying attention to the things that they're wearing or the things that they may be into. I know something for me, I go on the younger kids, like a TikTok, and you'll have the teachers who are on there. It's like a really funny way, but they'll talk about like the new kid slang, talk about like Riz and Skibbity Ohio and all of the things. And when I try to make a funny, corny older person joke trying to use the new lingo, I feel like it's always a funny way to kind of like break the ice, right? Because they feel like you're trying to be cool and you're trying to know, right? But you're doing it in a really like off corny way, so they never really agree with it. But it's just always a fun way to break the ice. Well, what does that actually mean? Asking them about the words and the lingo that the kids are using, and then also talking about their things that they're into. They're into snacks and hot things in music and choosing clothes. So those are, I think, ways I lean a lot on the young people that I have around me too, and just observing what they're doing and what they're talking about, what the trends are, because things go in waves and all the kids tend to know about the same things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Sydney mentioned earlier is, giving them a snack. Having like, a few snacks in your bag if you want to do like the hot Cheetos or granola bar or something else, like, just offering them something because it may be that they're hungry, it may be that they haven't eaten today. And so I think food is always a way to join people, and just giving them that nourishment too. And so it can make them feel better. You're now like a friendly person. Using the slang if it's your own child, as I have a 10-year-old kid. When I try to say Skibbity Ohio or Sigma, that's so Sigma, it's a great way to break the ice, yes. And it also adds some humor in there too. So it kind of takes a very serious situation and kind of like, diffuses a lot of that seriousness. Yeah, so Patricia says that they've been advised that they cannot give snacks. Totally understandable. You don't know what somebody's allergies are, if there's any kind of dietary restrictions, if there's any kind of medical stuff, if they're diabetic or anything else going on. Some of the teams have also incorporated having swag. So maybe if there's a little stuffed animal, if there's a fidget spinner, if there's something else that you're able to give them that would be able to, be a comfort item. Do you have any other ideas, Erin or Sydney, if they're not able to give snacks?
Yeah, if you're not able to give snacks, I think sometimes small sports things like that, analogies, that's a way to connect, asking about if they have sports interest or even just hobbies in general. And using that as like a starting point for a dialogue or a conversation. If you have a football or a basketball or something to throw and toss around that's accessible and it's appropriate in the space that you're in, sometimes just doing something with your hands is a good way to get your mind off of things that are going on in the minute. So that's stickers, especially if you're working with like the younger kids, the fidgets and things like that, could be helpful ways with them. And then I think also just, of course, asking them what they're into, what their interests, they'll tell you.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. And I was going to share and reiterate that too. Like having something to fidget with your hand if your agency provides you little fidgets that you could bring with you when you're responding to youth, or sometimes, we're sharing, explore what their interests are. If you're with youth who just do not want to talk in that capacity and aren't interested in that, is there like a comfort, like stuffed animal or a comfort blanket or a comfort pill you want to just like hold, or even have, as Erin was sharing, like passing a basketball around, sometimes having like that physical component or going for a walk and having a conversation. Every youth is going to be different, so you got to try on some different things in the moment and see what lands. But yeah, really focusing on how you can build connection based on what that youth is needing.
Yeah, and there's some great comments in the chat section as well. Kind of diving in further to what their interests are. And then, Bonnie shares that she had a youth who was into psychology and his family didn't understand like why he was into that. And then just being able to share that knowledge with him and being able to, have that discussion with somebody who does understand why it's exciting and being in the field. And then Manning also says that, this is a bigger opportunity to form other connections with other teams and being able to have things turn into youth groups, Girl Scouts, and to coordinate toy drives too. So it's kind of like building on and developing our community as well. Bonnie also says using a translation line for the conversation. Absolutely, 100%. I think a lot of times in working with families, and our subject matter experts here definitely touched on it, is that many times children are used as the interpreter. And so we want to make sure that we're not putting the kids into that parentified role of having to discuss their own mental health, let alone family dynamics as acting as an interpreter. So absolutely 100% Bonnie, using those language lines. One of the things that I have done in my previous work is really starting to learn the organizations in your area. So we had a gym who was welcome to allowing youth to come in and learn boxing. And so it was a great opportunity for us to do like a warm handoff and saying like, hey, if you're having a hard time dealing with things, if you don't have an appropriate outlet for your stress, or maybe you're missing a mentor or a coach. And so knowing what those organizations are in your area and being able to connect youth or families to those organizations is huge. So it's a lot of going and doing outreach. I know with summer coming up, a lot of times the calls slow down because schools are not in session. So talk with your supervisors. It's a great time to cruise around the community, going into some of the different gyms or clubs or different venues to find out how does somebody get access and what's the referral process for different or organizations. And maybe do they have scholarships? If it's something that costs money, do they have scholarships or other abilities to help families who may be low in income? So it's a great opportunity, as Bo kind of mentioned, just connecting to, I'm sorry, Manning mentioned, to connecting with other folks in the area.
That's awesome, Erin. And something that I want to add to that too, because I think it's really important to get families and youth connected to things that aren't directly tied to mental health, because that really helps build that preventative and those protective factors of just connecting them to their community and what's out there that's not necessarily tied to like a youth group or a support group tied to a mental health agency, because that constantly places folks in the environment, which is if it's helpful for them, absolutely connect them. But how are we also connecting them to just the fun things in life and just mentors and coaches, and they organically build their natural supports that way. So I really, really love that. We have a resource in our Sacramento area that we're currently housed. It's called Cakes for Kids. And for our families who can't afford to purchase those extravagant cakes for birthdays or for celebrations, we have lots of bakers in the area who make these extravagant cakes for our youth and families for completely free. And it's such an amazing way for them to feel celebrated and to feel like they're just like a part of like normal life without having to worry about all of the mental health things too, because that normalcy, it feels really important for youth. So I really wanted to just express how important that is.
Erin and Sydney, you guys have done an amazing job. A wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for partnering with us and sharing all of your expertise, and sharing your story. Having the lived experience is huge in this field, and we get to learn how our actions as mobile crisis workers out in the world impacts the families that we work with. And so every way that we're able to learn from those experiences is a huge knowledge opportunity for us. So thank you for sharing your experience. So thank you so much, Erin and Sydney, for being here. Thank you for your knowledge, for sharing your brains with us and sharing your expertise in working with children and youth and families. And thank you to all of our responders out in the world. You guys are doing the work. You are making a difference. You are out there saving lives. So thank you so much for all of the work that you do, that the seeds that you're planting in the lives of all of these families. And if you have any questions, any comments, any concerns, any way that us as M-TAC can support you in your community, in your counties, if we could help develop anything for you, we have our TA request form that's here. A lot of us are going to be heading out and doing some regional trainings in your local area. So see if you want to stop by and see our roadshow as we're taking some of these trainings live into your county or county near you. And then we're also doing a lot of site visits as well. So love to see what each of you guys are doing on your mobile crisis teams and be able to put eyes on and support in any way that we can.
I was just gonna thank you guys so much for having us here. It's been such an honor to be able to train with you all.
Yes.
All right.
Ditto.
Thank you.